Conclusion: the other side of the crisis. Mrs. Carter is a middle-aged mother whose teenaged son, a burly young high school football player, was in a fight in his public Philadelphia high school. Her son's troubles, however, are dwarfed by those of his teenaged sister, who recently gave birth to a baby boy. Mrs. Carter is especially concerned with getting her daughter to realize that mothers have certain responsibilities. She tells her daughter that being a mother is doing what you got to do, which often requires some sacrifice. Mrs. Carter recalls the sacrifices she made for her own children. "I've had all types of jobs," she tells me. "I've been called out of my name, verbally disrespected, many times," she says as she recounts some of her struggles to maintain her dignity at work. She encountered racism when she worked at Philadelphia's naval base, and as a McDonald's employee, she had people cuss me out. Retail sales. Telemarketing. People get mad, cuss you out. Now that her children are almost grown, Mrs. Carter is going back to school for medical billing, she says. She is looking forward to a job that involves little or no face-to-face interaction with others. "Now, I'll be done with people," she tells me. "I'll be behind the curtain." Mrs. Carter's desire to be behind the curtain, to retreat to the back regions of social life, represents a local knowledge about her own vulnerability in public settings and in certain interpersonal interactions. Her disclosure also reveals that using the strategy of situational avoidance is likely to extend beyond the adolescent years for poor, urban Black women. Her wish for a sort of protective invisibility is one shared by many Black women who have spent years fighting for the most fundamental sort of social respect. Black women who, like Mrs. Carter, spend their working lives in service jobs often are vulnerable to strangers' casual surveillance, inappropriate criticisms, and unregulated anger. Mrs. Carter tells her daughter that this disrespect for Black women in general will make the life of a young Black mother that much harder. "I told her she's Black and a woman, you got it double." For women like Mrs. Carter, the accumulated investment in developing effective situated survival strategies to navigate the double burden or triple oppression one of urban life eventually comes to resemble a larger, seemingly all-encompassing survival project that includes battles at work, home, school, and in the neighborhood. This project can be exhausting for many women. "I'm tired," Mrs. Carter tells me near the end of our talk. I'm out of words." "I'm tired" is a mantra recited by many mothers who, like Mrs. Carter, are facing old and new challenges as they try to make their own lives, and raise their children and grandchildren. What Mrs. Carter hopes to pass on to her daughter is a lesson that is familiar to the many women, mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and other mothers, who are trying to raise teenaged girls in troubled and sometimes violent inner-city neighborhoods. Urban, adolescent girls must understand that they will face unique challenges not only because they live in the inner city, but also because they must function in a world that is often harder for Black people in general and for poor, Black women in particular. Black femininity, strength, and survival. Historically, the material circumstances of poor, Black women's lives have required a commitment to raising girls to become strong women who can withstand the sorts of challenges imagined by Mrs. Carter. The narratives of the teenaged girls in this book reflect these locally held beliefs about the value of women's strength, which has been a historical force of female power for Black women. This embrace and expression of female strength, which sometimes contrasts sharply with traditional conceptions of white, middle-class femininity and Black respectability, were considered necessary for Black women's survival and for the survival of the Black community as a whole. African American inner-city girls who live in distressed and isolated neighborhoods or attend racially segregated schools may not fully appreciate the multiple oppressions they are likely to face once they transition from girlhood to womanhood. However, they and their caretakers are quite familiar with the immediate challenges, burdens, and dilemmas that accompany coming of age in today's inner city. In contrast to the relatively privileged lives of many suburban adolescents, inner-city girls, their parents, and caretakers must make complicated choices about safety and survival at very early ages. In many ways, the teenaged girls featured in this book are no less concerned with survival than were strong Black women and girls in earlier periods. However, in today's inner city, where poverty is deeply entrenched, and the culture of the code organizes much of social life, what a girl believes she has to do to survive has changed. In distressed inner-city neighborhoods, adolescent girls must actively work to develop ways to manage the various forms of violence that they may encounter in their everyday lives, ranging from interpersonal battles at school, to fights with their baby's father or intimate partners, threats of sexual assault, and the unpredictable violence associated with the drug trade. Like their male peers, many adolescent girls recognize that reputation, respect, and retaliation, the 3 R's of the code of the street, organize their social world. Teenaged girls like Delisha, Danielle, and Shantae appreciate the importance of maintaining a tough front and of demonstrating nerve in social interactions. They accept as a fact of life that sometimes you got to fight. 5 For these girls, adolescent fears of violating traditional expectations regarding what it means to be feminine are at times trumped by concerns for personal safety and survival. The stories of girls in this book also reveal a deep concern with survival projects that specifically reflect their class, race, and physical position within the inner city. The use of aggression and violence by young women in the inner city is sometimes modulated by girls' desires to meet expectations of appropriate femininity, perceptions that are deeply racialized. For example, a teenaged girl's desire to become a particular type of girl or woman, a good or pretty girl, for example, instead of a girl whom others evaluate as ghetto, can influence the degree to which she willingly takes part in physical battles. Girls' attempts to reconcile the gender dilemmas that emerge from these situated survival projects sometimes reflect and sometimes resist traditional, dominant views of femininity and locally based expectations of Black feminine respectability. Inner-city girls are cognizant of the code of the street as a system of accountability in the same way they understand gender expectations. African American, inner-city girls must reconcile the dilemmas and contradictions they encounter while navigating potentially dangerous settings. Girls like Takea and Danielle, for example, are committed to behaving in ways that others evaluate as good, yet they also come to believe that they must present a tough demeanor and be ready to fight, if necessary. At the same time, these girls will rely heavily on strategies of situational avoidance or relational isolation to minimize their involvement in potential interpersonal battles. Girls with reputations as fighters work the code of the street in ways that directly and often deliberately challenge both traditional and local expectations regarding femininity. Girl fighters may have realized early on that the value placed on their particular set of physical attributes may grant them a status as an outsider, and they may use this identity as a resource to challenge the relational and geographical restrictions that good girls often place on themselves. Some girls may embrace the identity of a ghetto chick, for example. She may be ready to fight all the time in order to ensure freedom, mobility, and protection in a setting where she knows that her safety is never guaranteed. In developing survival strategies that work for them, these girls embrace, challenge, reinforce, reflect, and contradict elements of mainstream and local masculinity and femininity. Their adolescent lives are characterized by this fluidity between and within the competing and controlling expectations of good and ghetto. The accounts provided by Terry, a self-disclosed violent person, and Danielle, a self-disclosed punk, and girls like them, reveal that African American teenaged girls coming of age in distressed urban areas are engaged in a racialized, classed, and gendered form of code switching. From this negotiation of overlapping and, at times, contradictory survival and gender projects emerges new forms of femininity that encourage and even allow girls to use physical aggression when appropriate without sacrificing any and all claims to a respectable feminine identity. Learning when and how to move back and forth between good and ghetto is essential to their struggle for survival in the most troubled inner-city neighborhoods. The structural and cultural context of inner-city life, including the rules and expectations embedded in the code of the street, exacerbates the problem of intimate violence in the lives of inner-city girls. Young men with few resources to enact mainstream notions of masculinity outside of their intimate relations find broad cultural acceptance for keeping the young women in their lives subservient with force, if necessary. Ember's story illustrates how the desire to be loved and to make a family outweighs her concern for ending a violent relationship. Her story also illuminates the pressing challenges facing young mothers who possess little social and economic resources beyond what is provided by their baby's father. Girls like Amber, who live each day at the intersection of multiple oppressions, are also likely to feel a deep sense of powerlessness after extended periods of abuse and manipulation. Amber eventually exhausted herself in her attempts to manage her violent relationship with Marvin. She did not gain a sense of power until she was able to use the resources of the criminal justice system, which stands ready to police and punish poor, black men, to keep Marvin in his place. Amber's embrace of a power that is rooted in dominance continues a cycle of dominance and intimate violence that is likely to further marginalize Marvin from mainstream society and increase Amber's vulnerability to Marvin's abuse. Ultimately, it is clear that strength remains a source of power for teenaged girls coming of age in poor, black inner-city neighborhoods. However, it does so with a contradictory twist, since using aggression or violence to demonstrate one's strength can seriously undermine the collective well-being of a community. Generally, the teenaged girls in this book did not, yet, couple strength with dominance. To the extent that they are representative, this offers some hope that structural and cultural interventions can reduce the increasing numbers of girls who enter hospitals or correctional facilities as a result of interpersonal violence. Without such interventions, the experience of inner-city girls may eventually become indistinguishable from those of their male counterparts, who live and all too often die by the code of the street. The other side of the crisis. Neither the wisdom that I gained from listening closely to the stories of the girls I met nor the methodological approach I used in this study provides an ideal basis for formulating broad policy recommendations. Still, my research does establish the necessity and the urgency of directing the attention of both scholars and policymakers to what I describe as the other side of the crisis. To be sure, poor, young, urban, black men face a difficult time in America. However, many of the experiences that shape their lives shape the lives of women and girls, too. The survival stories of young, black girls in urban areas reveal their strength and wisdom, but also their particular vulnerabilities. In order to fully appreciate their struggles, and the strategies girls use to overcome these challenges, we must resist attempts to frame these girls exclusively in the context of sexual deviancy, delinquency, or criminology. This type of approach sweeps away the dignity, humanity, and importance of girls' and women's lives. It is essential that feminist scholars, particularly black feminist scholars, resist allowing studies of teenaged mothers or gang girls, which are largely grounded in the sociology of deviance and or criminology literatures, to stand in for the lives of all poor, black women and girls. The lives of urban, adolescent girls are heavily influenced by the violence of gang life and the drug trade, which are deeply entrenched in the neighborhoods in which they live. However, most teenaged girls in inner-city settings are not gang girls or delinquents. This distinction is subtle yet significant in understanding how urban, adolescent girls navigate inner-city life. Joyce Ladner noted the danger of this skewed perspective over 35 years ago, in Tomorrow's Tomorrow, The Black Woman, her now classic study of girls in a St. Louis housing project. Her warning has gone largely unheeded. Today, the sociological and criminological literature continues to pay little attention to young black women's experience with conflict and interpersonal violence, except in the context of their participation in criminalized, deviant, or delinquent activities. Those few contemporary studies that do examine the experiences of everyday girls growing up in urban areas tend to find that violence deeply informs the lives of boys and girls, and that gender plays an important role in shaping adolescents' experience with violence. This book contributes to this developing literature on African American, inner-city girls' experiences with violence outside of purely criminalized or delinquent contexts. Placing young black women and girls at the center of more research projects in urban sociology would also help to correct what is ultimately a dangerously misinformed and potentially dehumanizing academic tendency to talk about race primarily through studies of crime, delinquency, or deviance. This book extends Ladner's tradition of inquiry by starting with a basic assumption that inner-city young women and girls are normal, albeit poorer, and thus more vulnerable than their middle-class counterparts. To be sure, the circumstances of life for the girls whose stories are featured in this book differ greatly from those of the girls described in Tomorrow's Tomorrow. Poor, black girls today are coming of age under economic and social conditions that are far harsher than those experienced by past generations. We have much to learn from their struggle for survival in these settings. As I talked with and listened to young inner-city residents, I saw the heavy burden they carry reflected in their eyes and in the way they carried themselves. I heard it in their voices. Why is it that inner-city girls must struggle so hard simply to survive? What can we do to make everyday life easier? When I asked my respondents what help they thought they needed, they responded with pleas that highlight how structural circumstances shape their experiences. These young people saw clearly that the violence in their lives was related, in some way, to their own economic and social isolation. The recent national catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina dramatically revealed the need for serious domestic policy to reduce the economic isolation of the nation's poorest citizens from mainstream American life and opportunities. There is a serious need for occupational opportunities in the inner city that provide steady work. A job is more than a paycheck, it is also critical to the development of one's sense of self-worth and connection to the rest of the world. Industry has effectively abandoned a population of workers of color in many large cities across the country. We are in need of national and local efforts that bring work back to these areas and to the lives of these inner-city residents who are struggling not only to survive but also to maintain their sense of dignity. The existence of decent work opportunities and improved housing conditions would likely influence the culture of inner-city neighborhoods in a way that could reduce the lethal violence that currently characterizes much of inner-city life. Such opportunities would make the easy money image of the drug trade less appealing to the young people who are recruited into the game every year. Their involvement in low-level drug trafficking assures the fact that many of these young men, and increasingly girls and women, will have contacts with the juvenile or criminal justice system, which will further isolate them from mainstream work and positive life opportunities. In addition to providing attractive alternatives for inner-city adolescents who might otherwise be recruited to sell drugs, we must end the war on drugs, which is effectively a war on young black men and, increasingly, women. I believe that with the wisdom of hindsight, more than one scholar will conclude that the tough-on-crime drug laws of the late 20th century were uncivilized and crudely veiled versions of the black codes that sold black men, women, and children into the convict lease system in the early part of the 20th century. This war with no winners has snared great numbers of young people, channeled them into secure detention facilities, jails, and prisons, and then spit them back into the most distressed urban neighborhoods in the country. This cycling into and out of the harsh culture of dominance and violence that exists behind prison walls has disrupted and damaged family and social networks, and has endangered the lives of all inner-city residents. In addition to reducing the likelihood that neighborhood street corners will become battlegrounds, ending the war on drugs might also improve the culture of city police departments and encourage police officers to interact with residents of hyper-criminalized neighborhoods in a way that ensures that all city residents, regardless of income status or skin color, receive the protection that they are entitled to from institutions like the criminal justice system. The structural changes outlined above would improve the everyday experiences and life chances of the inner-city girls and women that I interviewed and encountered during my 3 years of field research in Philadelphia. These changes would likely have broad, positive effects on both men and women. Yet, there are also certain changes within the politics and perspectives of the black community, across lines of class, that must occur in order to reduce the burden of the struggle for poor, black girls today. First, black leaders who highlight and politicize the crisis of the young, black male must give equal and simultaneous attention to the struggles of young, black girls. We must focus our attention on these girls now. Scholarly and political work must expand to encompass the other side of the crisis, the dismal life chances of poor, urban, black girls. Ignoring the plight of these young residents of the inner city wastes time, energy, and resources while simultaneously reinforcing the sort of gender politics that have isolated black women in the past, to the detriment of the entire black community. The lack of respect accorded to young black women, from media representations of video hosts to everyday interpersonal interactions in which black girls are called out their name, is a fundamental problem that must be central to any discussion about the crisis facing young people of color today. Mainstream representations of the black female body, which urban girls and boys begin absorbing at very young ages, suggest that black women are objects, available for white and black men to use in whatever ways they choose. Each time I share my research findings with other black women, from academic colleagues to my own hairstylists, who work in neighborhoods similar to those described here. They respond with stories of their own about young, Black girls who have been severely abused, sometimes with at least one immediate family member's knowledge. With every new story, my own frustration over what is allowed to happen to Black girls in general, and to poor, Black girls in particular, soars. These girls are made more vulnerable because of their race, age, and economic status. It is time that mainstream Black leaders, especially men, confront these issues with the outrage, conviction, and intolerance that the violation of Black women and girls demands. There is one more aspect of the other side of the crisis that must be acknowledged, namely the skin color hierarchy that continues to inform not only white Americans' perceptions of Black women and girls, but also Black people's perceptions about good and bad Black women. Colorism, notably the privileging of light skin and other related characteristics, has lingered since the end of slavery and continues to permeate girls' sense of self-worth in a way that divides them from one another. Colorism is one of the most dehumanizing and divisive elements of contemporary Black life, and it limits the quality of relationships among adolescent, Black girls. I have found hope and comfort in the strength, perseverance, and wisdom evident among the poor, young, Black women and girls who shared their stories with me. At the same time, I feel a deep sense of frustration and even fear for these girls. Many are so deeply committed to a belief system that they think is protective, but that I know is also potentially destructive. The survivor mentality characteristic of many girls reflects a disturbing sense of individualism that diverges from Black women's experiences in earlier periods, a lack of interest in a collective survival and an almost obsessive concern with one's own survival. This mentality reflects and reproduces divisive racialized gender dynamics. It encourages young women to trust no one. Such a perspective, especially if it is developed early in life, has the potential to shape girls' relationships into early adulthood and beyond. I also feel an anger that I know is familiar to these girls, and to other Black women across the country, regardless of their class position or the shade of their skin. Despite all of the advances made over the last century, survival remains a struggle for many Black women in America, but especially for poor, Black inner-city girls. Life will continue to be a struggle for these girls until we come together and fight back with the lessons learned from their stories. If I have learned anything from my years of researching and writing this book, it is that the battle for respect, dignity, and positive life chances is not one these girls should have to fight on their own.